And here we are in Module 2, and we are going to be talking about assessment strategies for students with severe or multiple disabilities. The information presented here comes from a textbook entitled Physical Education for Children with Moderate to Severe Disabilities. If you don't have this text, it's an awesome text to have. It has information on universal design, peer tutoring, peer educators, foundational skills, sensory integration, even aquatics for students with disabilities, and it has sample lessons using universal design for learning, along with modifications for several activities. So it's a great text. All right, so we are going to hopefully, after you've gone through this information, you will be able to discuss the role of assessment and what role it plays in educating our students with severe and multiple disabilities. You will be able to describe the types of alternative assessments that can be used, and hopefully you will be able to use assessment data for program planning and implementation when teaching students with severe and multiple disabilities. We have to keep in mind that assessment is the cornerstone of effective teaching. Effective assessment determines the unique physical or motor needs of our students with disabilities. Assessments assist in the development of physical education goals, and they serve as a useful tool for monitoring student progress. So what determines the effectiveness of an assessment is how accurately it reflects the capabilities of the person being assessed, not necessarily the disabilities, but the capabilities. So when we look at traditional assessments, and here's a short list. If you'd like to see a more extensive list, there's a link there on PE Central for a list of a lot more traditional assessments. But most of these assessments do not always accommodate students with disabilities. Even tests that have been specifically developed for students with disabilities, such as the Brockport Physical Fitness Test, these are not designed to accommodate our students with severe disabilities. Therefore, we need to look at alternative assessments. So alternative assessments are going to be obviously different from our traditional assessments, and that's what we're going to get into. The first thing we need to do when we are set to conduct an assessment with one of our students is we need to find out their primary and secondary conditions. Yes, they may be labeled as cerebral palsy, but do they also have a seizure condition, visual impairment, intellectual disability? We need to make sure we understand their restrictions or contraindications to any type of positioning or movements. What type of medications are they on? Have there been any surgeries that may affect their movement and positioning? And of course, just their general health or medical information that might influence how you're going to work with these students. And here are just a couple examples. For instance, you have a child with cerebral palsy who may develop scoliosis, and that scoliosis may be corrected surgically inserting rods along either side of the spine, which of course is going to restrict certain movements and positions. Another student with severe multiple disabilities may have a feeding tube that should be covered and or padded when the children are in a prone position on a mat or placed over a wedge. In addition, that position just may not be a good position for a child with a feeding tube. It just depends on the kid. And then, of course, we have some children with severe multiple disabilities who may have a seizure disorder in addition to a physical and cognitive disability. So we need to be aware of what's going on with our student. These are just some really long definitions. Basically, an alternative assessment is one that's different from our traditional assessments. So instead of giving students a true-false multiple choice type test, they may draw a picture or make a video of a particular skill. Okay, hopefully you'll be using a rubric, so we're not being subjective with our assessments. These assessments are sometimes performed in a real-life setting as opposed to a clinical setting. And that's what's called an authentic assessment. For example, instead of taking a skill out of the context of a game, we would observe the skill in the game. The example that I've always used with my pre-service teachers is you have a bunch of cones out on a basketball court and you're asking students to dribble in and out of the cones. My question to them is, how many cones are you going to see during a real basketball game? Hopefully they say none. And then I can ask, well, then why are you having them dribble around cones during an assessment? It's not authentic. So an authentic assessment is conducted in real life situations and gives our students a chance to demonstrate their skills, knowledge, and competencies in both age-appropriate and developmentally appropriate functional activities. And functional activities are those activities that occur in everyday life of the learner. And here is a quick example. This is Rachel, one of the first students that I worked with, so I look way younger in that picture there. But Rachel's parents wanted her to be able to sit at a restaurant in a regular chair instead of blocking the aisle with her wheelchair. So one of the things that we worked on with Rachel, who has cerebral palsy, is her sitting balance. So we worked on her sitting balance in different environments on different surfaces. So in the one picture, she's just sitting on a bench, and there are no sides to the bench, but she does have the back there to help support her. And then we were also working on her sitting balance on the floor. So we were working on something that is authentic to her everyday life. And this is an actual assessment that was created. It's called the FASSD, the Functional Assessment of Students with Severe Disabilities. And it's for students who have extremely limited mobility, and it's going to assess their basic functional movement, positioning, mobility, physical fitness, and sensory abilities. So if we want to assess positioning, we would place the student in these different positions. They'd be lying face up, lying face down, with and without a wedge, sitting in a wheelchair, sitting on a mat, and standing in a stander or gait trainer. In each position, we would prompt the student to move the head, arms, and legs, and to grasp and release objects. It's important to prompt the student to move when objects are positioned or presented to the left, to the right, and at midline. And then you'd record the results to determine which position promotes the best functional movement. And you would score them using a range of 1 to 5, and you see the different criteria there. And here we have an example of an assessment criteria for standing in a stander. So as Noah there is practicing some weight bearing, we might assess if he reaches from objects presented to the left, to the right, or to the midline. And then we do that with his left arm and his right arm, and in head movement. Some students who may not have as much movement as Noah up here might have to do or use switches. And here are just some examples of switches. We have a switch controlled toy, which a student can use with his hands over here. And then there's a hand button down on the lower left corner. In the middle, there's a joystick. So if a student has the mobility to go in different directions. There are head switches. There is a sip and puff switch, so students can puff into a straw or sip on a straw, and it makes different things work. Different lights come on, fans come on, letters typed on a computer, whatever you can program it to do. So there's many different types of switches. So if we're going to look at positioning, we also look at balance. Okay. Students should be evaluated on their balance when placed in unsupported sitting or standing positions. Semi-independent sitting or standing, and perhaps walking with a walker, could be targeted goals for students who show some writing responses. When I say writing, it's RIGHTING responses. And the ability to maintain balance when sitting or standing. Okay. We would score students based on how long they can sit or stand consistently in 3 to 5 trials of 1 to 3 minutes, noting how much support they need to sit or stand. There has been some research, excuse me, that shows that if a student can learn to sit or stand independently for 30 seconds, they can learn to do it for 5 minutes. It just depends on their strength and endurance. But once they have that ability to stand for 30 seconds, then the time limit can be increased. Okay, so information obtained from this assessment can then be used to identify the limb the student can move most functionally and the position that promotes the most active and functional movements. And here's an example of our friend here, and that's actually a colleague of mine. Her name is Christine. She's an adapted PE teacher as well. But the functional positioning or balance analysis would tell you where to place the ramp or switch, to the left, to the right, or at midline, and what position is most functional for the student. So here it looks like that ramp fits right over his lap, right in midline, and he can use his, looks like he's using both hands, a little bit more on the left hand to push that ball down the ramp. All right, functional mobility. Functional mobility for students with severe disabilities refers to the ability to move from point A to point B using basic mobility skills such as rolling, walking. Walking can be independently or with an assistive device such as a walker, using a wheelchair, manual or electric, or crawling or creeping. Included in this analysis is the preferred mobility methods and the distance the student can travel. For example, maybe independently for 10 or more steps, taking 2 or 3 reciprocal steps, whatever it is. The results can then help you determine whether mobility is possible for the child, which type of mobility is most appropriate, and where to start teaching the student to improve mobility skills. So we've talked about positioning and balance and mobility. Now we're heading over to physical fitness. So most students with severe disabilities cannot perform traditional physical fitness test items such as push-ups, sit-ups, the mile run, or a set and reach test. However, functional physical fitness is a measure of both basic strength, flexibility, and cardiorespiratory endurance with reference to daily activities. So for example, strength can be measured in terms of the ability to push their head off the mat when prone, bear weight when standing, hold a weighted object, or push a weighted object, for instance, push a ball down a ramp. Functional cardiorespiratory endurance is measured by how many steps a student can take in a gait trainer before needing to rest, how long a student can push a wheelchair before needing to rest, or how long a student can participate in physical activities before needing to rest. And then functional flexibility is a measure of the general range of motion in arms and legs with reference to basic physical activities such as reaching to grasp an object or pushing a ball down a ramp. Okay. So we've talked about positioning, balance, mobility, physical fitness. The last one we're going to look at is sensory processes. Assessing sensory processing is also important to learn the best sensory mode in which to present information, whether it's visual or auditory. This type of assessment also helps determine whether the student has any sensory sensitivity. Sensory preferences, for example, strength in understanding visual information, as well as sensory sensitivity to certain stimuli. The student might get upset in loud environments or be tactily defensive, can be tested systematically. This is really important because if we have a student who we walk into the gym, and as we all know, the gym to us is organized chaos, but for a student with a sensory disability or sensory sensitivity, basketballs flying around can be a literal nightmare. So we have to be cognizant of their visual and auditory sensitivity. All right, let's talk a little bit about rubrics. A rubric is a form of assessment used to measure the attainment of skills, knowledge, or performance against a consistent set of criteria. They are designed to be explicit, observable, and measurable, and easily adapted for students with disabilities by adding a measure for level of assistance, such as totally independent, partially independent, or requiring partial physical assistance and full physical assistance. So not only do we have this skill that we're looking at, but we can add in how much assistance they need to achieve each part of the skill. So we're going to task analyze a skill. We're going to break a skill down to its components. Then we would use that task analysis to create levels of difficulty. We would assign a point or hierarchy score to each level to determine the overall score, and then add levels of assistance, which we talked about, and then add measurable criteria to determine a criterion score. So here is an example of a rubric of catching a ball. So for each task, you'd score a point for an attempt or completion, check off the level of assistance needed, score criteria based on the outcome. So the FPA would be full physical assistance, PPA is partial physical assistance, and then IND is independent. So this is just a quick example. Rubrics should be created with all students in mind. So in other words, they should be universally designed to consider as many variables as possible, such as equipment, rules, and environmental variations. Rubrics should also include a range of individual learning capabilities. Then we have our task analysis assessment, or TAA, which is similar to the rubric. However, this type of rubric or type of assessment relies heavily on measuring levels of independence. Okay, so like rubrics, the TAA analyzes each skill, but unlike rubrics, it quantifies the levels of assistance and assigns a score of independence. Goals can then be developed for improving levels of independence in addition to improving performance. Okay, so one of the unique aspects of this task analysis assessment is that it provides both a qualitative and quantitative way to measure a skill. So first, the skill would be analyzed sequentially. Then levels of assistance are given a quantitative value. So for instance, total physical assist might be a 1, partial physical assist would be a 2, and independent would be a 3. And a student who must be physically put through the full motion of the task would receive a score of 1. And then from there, you can either remove prompts, remove verbal cues, and use that to write goals, physical education goals for the student. And here is an example of a task analysis assessment for the bench press. So it starts from very basic. Can they lie on their back on the bench? Can they place each foot on either side of the bench with the knees bent? And on the proper side of the bench, so meaning 1 foot on one side, 1 foot on the other, extend bars and arms to reach the bar, etc. So the skill is really broken down into its most fundamental parts. So again, one example. Ecological task analysis is a little different because it provides students with choices for executing skills. So the teachers will set up the parameters, or objectives, if you will, and then the students then choose the type of equipment, the rules, and the pace of the activity within which they are performing the skills. The teachers then observe and record data about these behaviors and use the data to challenge students within their comfort levels. So this system offers quite a few advantages because the teacher learns what movement form and equipment are most comfortable for the student, and the student starts out with success, and the teacher knows that the student is being realistically challenged because that teacher has set the task goal. There's no right or wrong choices for equipment or performance. However, the equipment the teacher offers limits the student's choices. So the ETA is used to determine preferences and skill levels, and is a starting point for deciding how to further challenge the student. Okay? So although, in a real world, ideally, we want our students to be in control of their own choices, but realistically, some of our students with disabilities cannot independently perform the task or choose their preferred objects. So in these cases, the teachers would provide some assistance, present a limited number of objects, and try to ascertain students' choices by facial expression, pointing, or other indicators. And some students may even be able to make choices by selecting from a picture board or using an app on an iPad. And then we would maintain their choices, maintain data to go forth. Okay, that's just one more example. And we have rubrics continued, and we're looking at a basic skills assessment. Because adapted physical education, we're not a service. I'm sorry, we are a service, but we're not a placement. So when teachers say to me, oh, so-and-so's in adapted PE, I tend to get on my high horse and correct them and say, no, they're receiving adapted PE. Adapted PE is not a place, it's a service. And we have to make sure our teachers understand that. But as you know, many of our students are often included in the GPE class, even though they have special needs and IEPs for physical education. For this reason, assessments that can accommodate all learners are very useful for teachers. So the Basic Skills Assessment, or the BSA, for use in inclusive physical education classes is ideal. The BSA was developed to assess a heterogeneous population of students, from those with severe disabilities to typically developing students in a variety of curricular units. This curriculum-based assessment aligns with content areas taught in physical education. So, for example, you might want to assess the skills of softball. And here are the 7 different skills of softball. We have throwing, pitching, catching, fielding, batting, base running, knowledge of softball, participation, safety, and social responsibility. And then each one of these skills can be broken down further. So maybe we want to break them down into emerging, basic, and competent. So let's look at throwing. So throwing, emerging might be they just throw that softball in any direction. That's an emerging skill. A basic skill, they can throw the softball in the desired direction. They can throw the softball to the designated teammate. Okay, so that would be basic. Competent then would be throws a ball underhand to a target at a distance of 15 feet, or throws a ball overhand to a target at a distance of 45 feet. So each one of these skills can be broken down even further and given different levels of emerging, basic, and competent. Okay, so that can be quite an extensive assessment. So, in summary, the assessments presented in this chapter are designed to provide data on the motor performance and learning abilities of students who have traditionally been a challenge to assess. These alternative assessments provide information on students' present levels that can then be used to determine their strengths and weaknesses, set goals, and plan instruction. Now that you have information on assessment for students with severe and/or multiple disabilities, make sure you watch the videos about modifying fitness tests and read the information about the charge syndrome. Excuse me. Last thing, you're going to be submitting your assignment for Module 2 to my email, houston@azhpe.org.